So I'm going to kick off just talking a little bit about the principles in this series of events before we dive in to hear from our three brilliant speakers this afternoon who have very kindly given up their time to come and be part of this discussion. I keep saying this, that everybody here is a star, and everybody here we think has got something interesting to say, however you come at this subject. I guess they are stars among stars, and we're really keen to hear what they have to say and to get into conversation with them. As I say, just to frame that, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the evaluation principles themselves. So when we were first doing some consultation about what the Centre for Cultural Value could bring to the table, we did quite a lot of consultation sessions around the country, and really, well, to my surprise, I think less perhaps some of my colleagues' surprise, but to my surprise, one of the top topics that people were interested in was really help with evaluation. So obviously, all sorts of other things that the centre does, in terms of capturing value, sharing research, and so on. But it was very high on the top of the list, particularly among cultural practitioners, that people wanted help specifically with doing evaluation. And we took the view early on that perhaps our job was not to necessarily promote a one-size-fits-all how-to approach. We definitely weren't particularly interested in serving up a toolkit. But we thought we might be interested in sharing some first principles to think about values and considerations, some coordinates to steer by, if you like. And so that's what we set off to do. We did some background research, which was led by Dr. Beatriz Garcia. We looked at evaluation principles as they were used in other sectors. So I think we looked at the NHS and at the UN, lots of different kinds of organisations have them. None of them were entirely convergent with our views of evaluation and its particular purpose. So we felt we really did need something that was specific and relevant to the cultural sector. For example, the NHS were very, very prescriptive and very specific, and the UN ones were very political. They're not entirely appropriate. And we realised we did need something that was about us, about creative practice, about taking into account the need to capture complex interwoven layers of creative and learning and social value, if you like, something that's very particular to the way that we all work. We then undertook a co-design process with around about 40 odd mixed practitioners, some of them academics, quite a lot of people who might call themselves evaluation specialists / nerds and are proud to say so, and then people who just use evaluation. So it's a bit of a mix, but people who have quite a strong interest in evaluation, either in leading it, delivering it, or using it. And then we came up essentially with 12 principles specific to the cultural sector, and we grouped them under under four headings rather. Beneficial, which includes the notion of being a purpose and use. Robust, rigor and method. People-centered, thinking about empathy and ethics. And connected, all around how we communicate and share the things that we learn. So, as you can hear, the principles are, to some extent, what's not to like. But what we recognise is that putting the principles into practice is the real challenge. And that's what this series of events, and indeed other things that the Centre is doing, is all about. So adhering to these sort of high-minded principles is great, but it's quite challenging when we're firefighting. We've got limited resources. We have many, many other pressures on us from outside, as well as our own feelings and biases. And it can be really tough. So we're recognising that. And again, this series is designed to really get to the heart of the matter here. We're really grateful to our speakers and delighted that they're coming to talk to us about this. But I want to stress that everybody here has got interesting experiences, challenges and questions, and I think opinions to share. And we're really interested in hear those things. We tried to make these sessions all about celebrating the plural view of what evaluation can be. And of course, that's particularly relevant to our subject today. The notion of listening to many voices. As we mentioned, it's an event of two halves. The first bit is very much us talking and you joining in. The second part is all about all of us having a conversation together. And I know not everyone will necessarily have the time or will to stay and do that, but we really do encourage you. It's a really great chance to sort of stop and reflect and think about how to apply some of the things we've been talking about. But we totally respect you may have some other things you need to do this afternoon. So this second session, listening to many voices. Now, this is one of the principles that sits underneath the people-centered idea, which also includes the concept of being empathetic, i.e. starting where our beneficiaries are, and socially engaged, being transparently supportive of the needs or agenda of any community that we're working with. I suppose it's about the real world challenges of seeking out, genuinely listening and being true to many different voices. And I guess handling the reality that, you know, value is assigned differently by different people. So most obviously, I guess it probably applies to you in your work where you're working with a specific community that has particular needs. So if you're working in a socially engaged area, this may feel particularly relevant, and some of the challenges particularly recognizable to you. You know, it makes sense for us to think that if we're working with a specific community, we might also be learning with them as well. However, I think that in a world where many cultural organizations are trying to think more deeply about what it means to be relevant, listening to many voices is in fact a first step for all of us. So I think this is not only relevant to co-creative practice, although we can learn much from people who are specialists in co-creation. In fact, I think that if you know, this is one of possibly the most challenging of all the principles to actually apply in practice. It's easy to say, not easy to do. I think we feel it's really difficult to have a completely standard blueprint because context is all in this conversation. Although if you are looking for something close to blueprint, I can highly recommend Mark Robinson's 7 steps in how to create how to co-create an evaluation. I don't know, Emma, if you, yes, I think that's about to pop in to your inbox, but it's a really great walk through how you might apply co-creative thinking to the sort of, you know, the standard steps of evaluation, if you like. I think that this is really challenging because it's the one that requires us to deal with massive amounts of complexity, to manage conflict sometimes, to hold lots of ideas in our heads at once, to check our own privileges and biases all the time, repeatedly, to bring our self-awareness onto the table, and perhaps the most challenging, to ask other people to bring their self-awareness to the table as well. So in other words, it requires a very high level of both emotional intelligence as well as some kind of technical ingenuity as well. So I hope this session is not designed to make you feel daunted. It's designed to make you feel confident, to trust your own instincts, and to take some inspiration away from how others, our speakers and other people think about doing it. So what's going to happen? As I said, we're going to hear from our speakers. We're going to, which is about an hour or so, possibly a little bit longer. Then we're going to have a short break, and then we'll dive into that conversation. And we'll hope that you don't mind engaging through the use of the Miro board, so we can capture some of those ideas. I think Emma has prepared a little how to use Miro, which you should have seen in advance, but we'll walk you through that before we do it. Really importantly, I hope you, as I said, I hope you'll stay for that bit. But either way, if you leave early or if you stay for it, please do give us some feedback. We're really keen to know how this plans out for you, content as well as approach. We'll come back all together at just before 4:30, and then we will finish on the dot of 4:30. So now to our speakers. So I'm really happy to introduce them. I can't tell you how grateful we are for them doing it. Thank you very much. They all bring a different perspective, but I think the things that they have in common is having a special interest in what we might rather fancily called polyvocalism. They've all commissioned, led, been involved with and learnt from evaluation, and you'll see that it's quite core to a lot of their practice. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in their own words. We're going to go one by one. Do please pop your questions in the chat as we go, but we're going to answer them all when we get to the discussion bit. And we'll keep an eagle eye, I will too, keep an eagle eye out for anything in particular that you'd like to ask. We're going to invite Laura Ratnaraja, Morgan Cunningham and Stephen Welsh to speak in that order. And we're going to kick off with Laura, who you may, because she's often seen talking about digital diversity, leadership and many other things all over the cultural sector. Laura, I'm going to stop waffling on. Over to you.
So hi, I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. There you go. And I should be up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There you go. So, hi everyone. As Anne said, I am Lara Ratnaraja, and I am an independent cultural consultant, which nobody knows, including most of my family knows what I do. As Anne said, I'm always seen talking at things, or so I might actually just name myself a professional nag in future. But I mainly do a lot of work around diversity, digital leadership, and a lot of placemaking work at the moment. And in terms of, I suppose, where I come from in terms of evaluation, it's kind of like most of us. I've had three kind of aspects to it. I've run quite large European funded programs, RIP EU, but over the last 15 years, and so was commissioner of many evaluations. One for the funder, but also for our own kind of internal processes. I'm a collaborator and participant on many evaluations as a consultant, and I'm also a consumer of evaluations in that I read, somebody said to me once, they know me mainly because they don't have to read the reports. I'm one of those people that reads every single kind of culture report going. I read a lot of evaluations, and it really informs how I think about my work. And I think having those kind of, that sort of 360-degree view of evaluation is really important for how I work, because I kind of see things internally and externally, and I have an objectivity and a subjectivity. It's very tiring sometimes being me, I have to say, but I can hold those sort of dissonant kind of opinions in my head at the same time. And when it comes to evaluation, it says, why am I not moving? There you go. I think there are four things that I always think about. One, that it needs to be beyond the single authorial voice. And by that, I mean, if you look at a lot of kind of historical evaluations, particularly in culture, they're told in a very certain homogeneous way. They come from a very patriarchal and a system that, as we know now, is very kind of biased. And it's always a single voice. It doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the participants, and it's always an assertion. It's never kind of collaborative. It's never very cohesive in how it looks at things. And I think we have to move beyond that. We have to move beyond this kind of single voice that says this is what this evaluation is going to be read as. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's expensive rigor. I think sometimes we don't think we can do what it's one or the other. It's not a binary measure of what success looks like. I sat in meetings all today, actually, earlier, talking about what success looked like for a project, and it wasn't about metrics. Metrics might be part of it. It might be what your funder requires, but I don't think what an evaluation looks like is a pass or fail. So this is a successful project. Everyone had a great time. I had a project once where somebody complained about the biscuits, which I thought was probably a good test of a project. If the only thing they can complain about is the fact that there were no Garibaldi's, which is a very obscure biscuit to complain about, actually. But so I think we have to look at that kind of expanded notion of what evaluation is, and also what the story is, in terms of what we're capturing. And it's a story that you might want, but I think equally importantly, it's a story that you don't want to hear. That's part of the thing I think that's really important in evaluation. I don't know why my slides are not moving forward. Hold on. There you go. So for me, when I think about evaluation, I think about the three kind of principles underneath it, which really relate back to the principles that Anne referred to earlier. It's that when I'm working on evaluations, and also when I commission them, is that they're collaborative. And I work with colleagues on evaluation projects because that particularly brings a different kind of lens. Particularly for me, that means that I look at it through a lens of diversity and interpret it through that kind of lens. So again, it's about how we move beyond that single authorial voice. But I also like working in that kind of way because that's sort of quite challenging. It's really interesting. And instead of getting a single voice, you have a plurality of voices, which then you can synthesize. Increasingly, some of the commissioners that I work with, that's what they're looking for. They don't want to necessarily look at that's a success metric. They want to look at what is meaningful impact, and that's not necessarily always numbers. It's going to be inclusive. We have to make sure that participants aren't othered within an evaluation framework, particularly when I look at evaluations that are trying to measure how people have engaged with the project, particularly if they're coming from diverse or marginalized backgrounds. Participants are kind of othered completely in that. And I say that as somebody who, I was definitely said to Anne and Emma yesterday, that if I go to any cultural events, I just put my hand out for the evaluation form because I'm genuinely the only person of colour in the room, or one of a very small number. And I know that I'll be just like, come on, I'll do that for you now. It isn't the you of the people. It's actually about how do we make sure that an evaluation framework is inclusive and that it isn't extractive. The other thing I'm really uncomfortable about increasingly is how people's kind of backstory is mined for trauma within an evaluation framework, and that we take that kind of experience, we don't do anything with it, by the way, we just do it, we report on it, and then that again becomes a metric of success. And the thing about equitable is that everyone is treated equitably, despite the differentials in experience and in how they are treated in that kind of wider lens, and that value is considered throughout. Because I don't think you can look at an evaluation, if you're looking at how people are participating in a project, for example, if at the starting point people aren't equitable, then how are you measuring that? Because not everyone, especially people that have been disenfranchised or excluded from the cultural sector or from cultural programming, for example, they're certainly not equitable with other people that have a far greater privilege in how they participate in culture. So your evaluation framework needs to reflect that, but without othering it. So it isn't about, we have a level of culture that's up here, it's always in kind of these levels, isn't it? And another level that's down here. Or as somebody once said to me when I was talking about, they were talking about South Asian communities and how they engage. And I said, well, what about me? And they said, well, you don't count. So I don't count apparently because I work in the sector and therefore I'm not the right kind of Asian person. These things are, I'm going to write my book about all this stuff that's been said to me over the years. And my final slide is, again, what do we mean by equitable? How do you measure value or impact amongst participants when it isn't equitable to start with? What considerations do we need to take into account? When you talk about many voiced, there's a lot of considerations to make sure that those voices are included and that they're included on their terms, not necessarily on your terms. What about our own bias? Everyone has bias. There's nobody in the world that doesn't have bias. How we commission in our own images, we commission with our own biases, we commission with our own versions of what success looks like. And when it comes to interpreting evaluation data, for example, how do we make sure that the lens we're not looking at is completely binary? And again, that's going back to moving beyond a single authorial voice. And the final thing is how to interpret many voices and conflicting views. I'm not quite sure I've got the answer to this, but I think if we look beyond moving beyond an evaluation that is solely about metrics, if you look at metrics, then it becomes a kind of pass or fail. I think it's a yes or no. And I said to, and then what we get is we get a nice exec summary with some very nice, sort of very diverse photographs on the front, and everyone skim reads, and that's it, it's been done. And that's not always how it should work. Consensus isn't always the goal about evaluation, and conflicting views don't mean a project has failed. I'm not quite sure how you capture that. And I think sometimes part of the problem in that is that the system that we are being evaluated within doesn't allow for that kind of conflict, and it looks at conflict as a negative rather than as something where if you're looking at any kind of society, there is not going to be consensus amongst everyone. So I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that, but I think those are kind of all the considerations that we need to take into place.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura. I think you've thrown down the gauntlet in terms of asking us some quite big questions there. So consensus is not the goal. How are we going to persuade people of that fact? That's really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Now I'm going to hand over. Let's see whether consensus is the goal today or not. Morven, are you? I can't quite see you. There you are, Morgan Cunningham. And among other things, Morgan is the lead for Edinburgh's Creative Community Hubs, and she's also a fail-safe champion, of which I think she's going to tell you a little bit more. Morgan, over to you.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Anne. So my name is Morven Cunningham. My pronouns are she, her, and they, and I am a white person with tousled dark hair and big blue earphones. Yeah, I'm a freelance creative and writer. I call myself an ex-producer of festivals and events, and also a facilitator of networks, both large and small, which includes Culture Collective, which is a £10 million project funded by Creative Scotland, supporting participatory cultural activity in communities across Scotland. However, I'm going to talk about two other projects that Anne has mentioned and for this presentation, and I will just share my screen briefly. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the Creative Community Hub network that I'm working on with Whale Arts, which has produced the Working Better Together report, as you can see on the screen, hopefully, which came out of 6 months of research with a series of creative community hubs around Edinburgh. So the report itself looks closely at the often unequal relationships between community hubs and cultural institutions in the city of Edinburgh, both in terms of power, which can be wrapped up in funding, but also the differing value systems, which can end up undervaluing the importance of community-based art practices. So the report was co-written with my lovely co-worker Tiki, as you can see in that picture, and was launched earlier this year. It is available online. I think Emma will probably be popping that in the chat. So you will have access to read the report, so I'm not going to go into it deeply just now, but I just wanted to give a kind of brief overview of some of the issues contained in the report in terms of that imbalance with those relationships between community hubs and cultural institutions. These include not enough lead-in time prior to engagement, the fact that free doesn't always mean free, barriers to participation are not considered fully, the bums on seats approach doesn't fit well with communities, disregard for local knowledge and experience of those working within communities, helicoptering into communities, and adopting a copy and paste approach when it comes to working with all different kinds of marginalised communities. On a positive note, looking at better ways forward, there's also a pull-out poster that's attached with the report. I've got a copy of it here, but you can also see it on your screen too, which is called How We Would Like It to Be, which is becoming kind of a personal mantra and philosophy of mine across all of my current work. So as you can see, the how we would like it to be here include respect, trust, integrated programming opportunities, investment, both in terms of time and respect, but also with funds, and also that remembering that no one size fits all. So yeah, most of these aspects involve taking the time and space to connect with people in order to build strong relationships, and then investing in these relationships, as I say, with money as well as time. So part of my work now with the Creative Community Hubs is building on this network that we've created and working together to share knowledge and skills amongst the hubs. Recently, I ran a workshop with the community hubs entitled Failspace. So Failspace is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded research project that explores how the cultural sector can better recognise, acknowledge and learn from failure. Again, I think Emma's popping a link to Failspace in the chat. So Failspace itself is based on the principle that learning from failure should be an integral part of the process of making and implementing cultural projects and policies. Though the research that was carried out suggests that this is not always welcome in formal evaluation processes, as they tend to focus more on the celebratory facts and figures about a project's success and conceal, diminish or brush off negative outcomes or issues. So this is the workshop that we ran with the hubs earlier in the year. And this is me with my Failspace champion colleague, Johnny, outside of the lovely Whale Arts in Wester Hailes. So both Johnny and I are Failspace champions, and we encourage conversations about failure in the cultural sector. We run workshops that introduce people to the Failspace toolkit, which is a range of methods intended to kickstart conversations around failure. We ran a Failspace workshop as the hubs themselves are about to embark upon a series of funded creative projects as part of the current project. And as we believe that introducing conversations about failure at the start of a project really helps you to define what success and failure might look like at the end of the project, but also what success and failure might look like for who, because there's lots of many different stakeholders involved. So Failspace also encourages breaking down the binary between success and failure, the idea that nothing can be 100% hopefully failure or 100% success. But also, as you can see, you can get a little glimpse of the toolkit here. This is one of the methods. This is the 5 facets of failure. So breaking down from outright failure and outright success to precarious failure, tolerable failure, conflicted success, and resilient success. So my co-worker Tiki and I on the Hubs project are actually going to be conducting this Failspace exercise for the Creative Community Hubs project next week. And we intend to revisit it again at the end of the project in April as our personal means of internal evaluation of the project as a whole. And I think I might just leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you so much. It sounds like such a fantastic project. And although we talked about the fact that there are no blueprints out there, clearly there are quite a lot of quite interesting blueprints in
Cool.
invested at the moment, including that one. That's really interesting, and I'm picking up a sort of there's an interesting theme here about success not being binary, which I think we are going to have to return to. So really interestingly, Stephen, so let me leap to you now, finally. So Welsh, you don't describe yourself as an evaluator, but like our other colleagues, you do quite a lot of evaluation, I think it'd be fair to say, but another creative practitioner. Doing more work in museums perhaps as well, so another sort of a slightly different work environment. Over to you, Stephen.
Right, let me share my screen. Right. Well, yeah, a huge thank you to Emma and Anne for inviting me along today. And so, yeah, I'm a creative freelancer, and I specialize in co-creation. And the reason why I'm so passionate about co-creation and equity and representation is because I come from a town in West Lancashire called Skelmersdale. Now, Skelmersdale is situated almost equidistant between Liverpool and Manchester, hence this beautiful road sign here. And roads are going to be a metaphor that I use through this short 10-minute presentation to sort of talk to you about my experience of how I use evaluation to support co-creation practices when I'm working with different museums and arts, culture and heritage organisations. But yeah, I was born and raised in Skelmersdale in the 1980s. And for those that don't know the town, it was an ex-mining town that was a designated new town. So within the 1960s and 70s, families like my family in Liverpool were encouraged to leave the city and relocate to Liverpool for a better life. But the interesting thing about Skelmersdale, of course, it doesn't have a train station. So the only way you can really get in and out is if you drive and by motorway. But also, from my perspective, arts, culture and heritage, there really wasn't a provision for that. So if you wanted to experience museums or galleries or theatre, you had to either go to Manchester or Liverpool to access that. So that had a real impact on me in terms of how I perceive arts, culture and heritage as happening in other places and other people taking part in it. So that really informs my practice about making space for underrepresented people and groups to fully access arts, culture and heritage as best they can in a place, hopefully, that is familiar to them. So yeah, that's where I'm from. That's a little bit about my background. And over the past 15 years, as Anne said, I've worked mostly in museums. So I started at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. I was one of the project curators working on the development of the museum before it opened in 2007. And then from there, I went to Manchester Museum and I was the curator of living cultures and temporarily the acting head of collections for 13 years, up until recently when I became a creative freelancer. Now, in both those positions, I was working on people-centered collection-based projects. So connecting different cultures and communities and groups with collections and supporting them to tell the story that they wanted to tell, either in the International Slavery Museum or in the Manchester Museum. And with a couple of other hats on as well, I'm also a committee member for the National Lottery Heritage Fund North. So I've done that since 2016. So I'm very familiar with what it's like for applicants to submit and evaluate projects in order to persuade funders to part with money to support with particular projects. So that's a little bit of background. Now, what I do when I go in and I work with different museums and cultural institutions, effectively what I'm doing is trying to make a little bit of space for communities, histories and ideas by embedding co-creation practices. So the first step usually involves a review of policy and practice and conversations with key members of staff and participants. And so that, of course, includes existing evaluation reports. They're a key part of that process when I first encounter a client or a cultural organisation. And what I tend to find is there's a general consensus, and Laura's already touched upon this and Morven as well, about this sort of binary of success, this one track that we're all familiar with when we're developing and delivering a project. And that tends to be unilineal and is perfectly typified by this lovely country road here. So it involves the funder and the institution and the organisation, then the recruitment of the community group, then there's a period of development, and then there's delivery. And of course, evaluation reports really underpin this approach and support and confirm the key outcomes, that binary of success that we've already discussed so far. So in those evaluation reports that I'm scanning when I'm first trying to understand why co-creation perhaps has not taken off as successfully as it could have done in these cultural organisations, there's only usually minor recommendations for improvement, and there's no overt criticism of any one particular element of a project. So there's real dissonance there. So there's a dissonance between the need and the desire for the cultural institution to want to create more space for new ideas and new people, and these evaluation reports that are effectively affirming that the space is currently used sufficiently enough. So if consensus is the outcome, why are we missing? Where is the divergence? Because the divergence is fundamentally important for making space for these new ideas and people. So what do I mean by divergence? So when a project participants want to explore other routes or destinations, so we're all familiar with that one track approach. So you start a project, you finish it, you evaluate it at the beginning, the middle and the end. But we know what life is like, and life is messy, and we get divergence. Participants want to do different things. They grow and change through the life of a project. They want to explore different routes to get to the end of the project, and they want to explore, in some instances, multiple and different destinations, different outcomes, unintended outcomes. But this divergence, and we've already heard this as well, it can often be framed as conflict or disruption, or in some cases ingratitude, because it increases uncertainty. But it is a reality as participants grow and change on that project journey. As people begin to learn more about each other and the project, of course, inevitably they're going to grow and they're going to change, and their opinions and feelings are going to change. But this divergence, as I've already mentioned, is quite often omitted from the formal evaluation, so we don't even see that it's actually occurred. And the reason for this may be twofold. Again, the participants may have left the project who were changing their opinion and their perspectives as a consequence of their engagement with the project. Or what I found as well is that some participants, and I mean staff also, they're really quite reluctant to share candidly their views about how a project has actually gone. And this can cause hesitancy. So that idea that something can be perceived as a failure, people feel hesitant then about being candid, about sharing their opinion in the evaluation about what worked well, but equally what didn't work so well. So there's a reluctance to embrace divergence and disagreement in a project, and there's a concern about the complexity, criticism, and undermining the consensus. So they avoid collaborating with certain communities. Well, it can lead to avoiding collaborating with certain communities that they consider to be disagreeable. So there's no resolution really, there's no embracing of divergence or an analysis of it to help improve projects in future. It's omitted and can sometimes be considered to be disagreeable, so not included. So in that aspect, evaluation can actually reinforce the consensus by omitting divergence. And so in that respect also, evaluation does have a key role to play in supporting a more multilineal model. So we've got that unilineal model that we're all familiar with on development and delivery, and evaluation supports that. But if we move away from that binary, as Lara and Morven have already shared with us today, and we approach a more multilineal model, so I think more in terms of circulation. And this is a lovely picture from my hometown again, and this is a local landmark. So this is the Half Mile Island. So for people that don't know very much about Skelmersdale, it was built with the intention that there would be a flow of traffic all over the town, and there are no traffic lights, so there were just roundabouts. So if you're a first-time visitor to the town, it's very easily to get lost in the flow of the traffic. But this is one of our wonderful landmarks. So this is the Half Mile Island. So I often talk about circulation. So how can evaluation help co-creation and support a more circulatory system of ideas and people when we think about a project, again, moving away from that binary, that one single track? So what I mean when I talk about circulation is a space in which ideas, voices, and possible outcomes can flow. It's committed to a co-created set of joint responsibilities. So, of course, we've already heard about the potential of co-creating evaluation principles and frameworks. It has multiple entry and exit points and potential multiple end destination, and it allows for adaptation, innovation, and growth throughout the project lifetime. And evaluation could really support something like this. And again, this is aspirational. I don't have the answers about how this would work in reality. This is very much aspirational. So evaluation that is embedded rather than intermittent, evaluation that is project long and project wide, evaluation that can support change in real time and be responsive rather than analysing the data at the end and then retrospectively offering recommendations. So these are the sort of experiences that I've had as a creative freelancer when I've gone into work in cultural organisations from different perspectives. And I think I'll leave it there, folks.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Well, thank you, all of you. Some really, really interesting input there. I have to say, I'm going to put, please do now, pop questions in. If you want to speak directly, put your hand up. We're eyes out. Really great. I'm so loving the idea of sort of either binary or divergent, or in the kind of mature ascended way of thinking about it, a circulatory thinking way we think about working in a sort of many-voiced and learning from many voices way. That's such a useful metaphor, Stephen. I really want to come on to that. So I'm going to ask you all about the F word, because it has raised its head a lot in all three of your presentations, this notion of the problem about sort of binary ideas about success and failure, and actually sometimes those crossing over each other, because actually different people have different ideas about what those binaries might be. So if I was going to ask you all, and I'll come to all of you, a question about, well, if, as Stephen was suggesting, a circulatory model where we can actually channel all those different those divergent opinions in a more helpful, less chaotic way, if that's what we're aiming at, how do we actually create the right conditions to have a conversation about whose success? How do we create the right conditions to enable other conversations, to other notions of success to flourish? And I think, more than in a way, you have got an approach that you're trying, and is that what you're trying to do? So to all of you in different ways, tell us about, I'd really love to hear about how things that you think really help to enable us to break down that unhelpful binary. Can I come to you first, Morven, actually, because in a way, the research work you've been doing, I guess, is trying to get to the heart of that.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking about it. I mean, it's also about taking that time to build those equitable relationships, and that's, I suppose, the Working Better Together report was specifically looking at cultural institutions and community hubs, but equally could be with a variety of different stakeholders, including the participants of a project as well. There's also something, I mean, I just think taking the time and also talking about evaluation spanning, and I think Stephen mentioned as well, the entirety of a project, so that you're thinking about evaluating a project while you're thinking about the inception of a project as well. Because how can you truly imagine what success looks like, how we would like it to be, without kind of having those conversations at the very start? Yeah,
that's really interesting. Lara, any thoughts on that? About you brought this big idea into our thinking first. What do we do to stop it, to disrupt it, to make people calm down about it?
But I think there's a whole bigger issue within the cultural sector, but we haven't got time to address that bit anyway, because the evaluation is just responding to systemic issues that you've got anyway, but we haven't got like 3 hours to talk about that. But I think it's like Morven said, it's having the conversation at the beginning. I also think, by the way, not all evaluations are wrong. It's not like everything has to be done in this kind of way. Sometimes it is about metrics. You can't. I was on area council for the Arts Council for 6 years, and if there's no gap, you can't address it. So I think you've got to look at what you're trying to address with the project that then has the evaluation. It depends where you are in your career. Generally, if I'm being asked to do something, I'll kind of go back and say, I don't think that's the right way to do it, and we'll look at it in different ways. But I think it's having the conversation at the very start. Too often this kind of happens halfway through an evaluation, and actually you might not have the mechanics within it to to do an iterative evaluation, for example, or that it keeps reflecting, because this is a lot of money and it's a lot of resource on certain programs. So I think making sure that who's around that project at the start is really important. So either, when people have a steering group, they always just have the funder, they have somebody here, they never really think about who's going to come onto that steering group, because that really what you should have by the time you've got a brief for an evaluation. The project kind of concept should have really been worked out at the very beginning. And then the evaluator, have an equitable relationship with the evaluator, not somebody who's been given a brief to go and respond to. Because then it becomes about metrics, then it becomes binary. And then you end up, I'm sure we've all been in here before, where you kind of end up arguing with the client because they don't want you to put certain things in the report. And that's when I think increasingly that's changing, because I think especially if you're looking at inclusion, if you're looking at how people are participating, I think that has to be a far broader conversation anyway. So you can't just look at numbers and metrics, because it has to be much more expanded than that. But I think that has to be all done at the very start of a program and not halfway through it or at the end of it. Yeah. And then there's a lessons learned symposium and that's it, it's done.
Yeah. I think there's also something there as well about like who's it for?
Yeah.
Because I think often people just think it's like for the funders, but if you start to think about, well, how would this be a success or failure for the different stakeholders, then you can start to kind of tease that out.
There's definitely there's an interesting Emily's really picked up on that idea of the embedded notion of an evaluator in it for the life cycle of the project. And I think you talk very eloquently about that, Stephen. Actually, interestingly, and quite a few people are agreeing with that. Actually, if you really want to make a difference, that seems to be something that's a recurrent theme. In fact, it came up in our last set of workshops again. I don't know if you'd like to comment a little bit on that. So there's something about the longevity, the being the right thing. In fact, when we were preparing for this session, we talked about this notion of actually, you talked about not just being embedded, but a sort of an intimate relationship with all the stakeholders. And we were talking about intimacy. Are there problems around that?
I think it's that point that Laura's just made as well, just somebody that is there on the ground and identifiable, because what I realised is, particularly with co-creation, is that with community participants in particular, so many of the functions of a cultural institution may be alien to them and may not be explained to them, even for the entirety of the project they're involved with. So particularly evaluation, because the idea that we get impartiality or we avoid bias is by having somebody very external with a more almost sort of helicopter perspective on what's been going on. With what I've found when we've been building co-creation frameworks and models with different institutions, the community members talk to me about dispute resolution. How will you cope if we disagree? How will you cope if we change our mind? And what I've always been interested in is there's a really wonderful opportunity for the evaluator there in a very different role. So the evaluator, like I say, is on the ground for the duration of the project, checking in, sense checking, doing regular consultations monthly or twice a week. And again, like Laura said, this takes money and it takes staff to be able to do it. But what you would find as well, when we talk about dispute resolution, a sort of third party that's there, part of the project, an evaluator could play that role. And so if somebody had a disagreement or somebody said, well, actually, we're not very confident about the outcomes for this project anymore now that we're 6 months in and there's 6 months to go, they can discreetly speak to an evaluator, and the evaluator can act in real time to bring all the parties around the table and say, listen, people are changing their mind, the direction of travel is shifting, or there's been a disagreement. Can we sit down together and reformulate a plan? Now, then that is also systemic. So the funders need to be comfortable with unintended outcomes, because what we're doing is straitjacketing people. So community participants and staff as well can end up feeling straitjacketed because we have predetermined outcomes. So we've agreed to do this, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it by this date. And the evaluation will help us demonstrate how successful that's been. When actually we sort of move to a more messy, complicated model, but again, that is resource and staff intensive to be able to do it, I think.
Can I add to that then? Because I think, oh, am I echoing?
Yeah, but you're right. Keep going.
Okay. I think it's easy as well. I think the funders, Generally Arts Council, gets the blame for everything in terms of measurements, and then that takes all the responsibility off the sector itself, because I'm going to mention the systemic issues within that, because I think also it's easy to blame a funder when you don't really want to change the power dynamic that you've got, because what the evaluation does show is that it's completely inequitable. So coming back to that point about equity and what you just talked about, Stephen, is that half the people we're trying to evaluate, especially if you're looking at kind of engagement projects, and I do use that as a, you know, I hate all these words, but I'll use them for ease rather than anything else. But we're talking about taking people that have less involvement in what we perceive as culture, or what the cultural organization perceives as culture, and then it's a fail if numbers don't engage with it and things like that. Well, actually, what if they're not interested? That's, you know, so what what an evaluation sometimes shows is whether the inequity in power dynamics, and people don't, but then people can say, well, no, the Arts Council want to see XYZ. Actually, you're not really changing what you're doing. So I think this is not just about funders. There has to be there's accountability and accountability across the whole sector to reframe how it's working, and evaluation is part of that. But I think we're still clinging to sort of blaming somebody for why evaluation can't work like this.
Yeah. I think I'm really keen, because it seems to me that in quite a lot of the sessions we've had around the principles, we always come back to this thing: if only funders didn't ask for this, you know, if only they didn't insist on binary things. And interestingly, when we talk to funders about that, they're quite surprised by that response. So I do think that there is I kind of tend to agree that there's a collective responsibility for us to elevate the conversation above that. You know, maybe we're quite pleased to inherit a kind of situation in which you know, we can shrug our shoulders and say, what can I do? You know, but I think this is a bit. But I wanted to come back to this point about you know, really being an intimate part of the process, and this notion of, you know, whether or not you can then be impartial, and whether or not impartial is absolutely necessary. So you'll notice that in the principles we didn't use the words impartial or independent, although they were often mooted when we were kind of talking about those things, and we ended up saying, I think it says open-minded was the value that we were looking for. And that was the debate was very hot about this in that co-creative group that looked at the principles, on the grounds that impartiality is always just a mirage, really. So actually we are always bringing our own agenda to it, and so therefore this was unrealistic. So in fact, you know, in fact, being very clear about your agency and what you're there to do and how far you can go, and negotiating that is almost a responsibility of the evaluator in those kind of cases. I was thinking a lot about that, Morven, in the conversations that you've been having about failure, that in a sense you've had to introduce that idea as a way. Has that been a way of negotiating what we're allowed to talk about and what we're not allowed to talk about? Has it been useful?
Yeah, it can also be quite challenging for a lot of people. I know that some other champions in particular, like that's also why I underline the importance of speaking about failure at the start of a project, I know have experienced coming in towards the end as a general evaluator would, and then kind of introducing that conversation about failure, which is not landed very well with the recipients. So yeah, it's something that I think that we're very we don't like telling stories of failure, and if we do tell stories of failure, we like to turn them around and tell each other that it wasn't a failure after all, and kind of ameliorate some of those feelings. And I think, although it's a difficult subject, I think it's a really important one. And for me, it's that, again, kind of bringing in that framework that of how we would like it to be, is looking at something, looking at it very almost coldly and saying, okay, why did this fail? And then thinking about, okay, next time, how do we do it better? How would we like it to be?
And I was interested actually because you mentioned that you become very interested in this idea about how we would like it to be over, you know, failure's fine, failure's all right, because actually we were talking the other day about the fact that, you know, the failure has become quite a trendy word in the cultural sector, but it may not play out like that for everybody if you're not part of that discourse. So this idea, but it's a simple idea that everyone can get behind, is like, you know, in order to work out how we would like to be, we have to talk about how some of the things that we don't like. And I was wondering if all of you had some advice about, I think, Stephen, you know, you were talking quite a lot about how you get into a sort of loop of consensus. So even people, if they've really got strong things to say, they don't want to be critical because they feel bad for the people who tried hard and had their, you know, they meant well, they just didn't necessarily, you know, that's really, how do you, I was going to ask all three of you if you had some advice about how you can create an environment where we're not kind of falling over ourselves just to say, oh, it was all, I don't want to go there, I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to upset the kind of the positive consensus. Has any, you know, and I think quite, if we leave aside you know, our worry about the big bad funder in the background, what do we do to actually encourage that? Have you got some advice and tips if we're fearful of doing that?
I'm going to point out, we have just been, well, we are still in the middle of a pandemic and we have gone through a lockdown, and I find it really strange in the cultural sector that there's a complete amnesia about some of this sometimes. So we're talking about an evaluation and a way of doing evaluation that worked when we could move and people were engaging in very different ways. So I think that kind of, you know, I think there's a lot more honesty and transparency about those conversations in a way you wouldn't have had before lockdown, because we're simply because we've had to, you know, we ran a whole program online. I'd never run a program online, and we were really honest about the fact that some of it might be a bit terrible, quite frankly, because we didn't know how to. And I think that's been a much nicer way of saying, you know, if your slides don't work or you freeze on Zoom in the middle of a panel like this, nobody sits there and goes, oh my God, that was dreadful. We kind of allow for those sort of things now. So I think we have to kind of allow that bleeding around the edge a bit more, but also look at what we're evaluating is completely different. It's not, we're not going to go back to what happened before. So we have to look at that. And I think also that's a responsibility of care for everyone that's involved now, because these conversations are quite exhausting. And when I talked about being extractive, if it was bad enough before lockdown, it's absolutely exacerbated by all of the kind of, you know, the cost of living crisis and all these other things that are happening. You're asking people to sort of participate in a way that it doesn't fit what happened before, because our context is completely different. So I think we have to look at the context and be really open about those things, but also have a really, I mean, I would like to think we're in a space where we can be more honest and transparent about how things work. You know, I'm not one for hiding my own opinion, as you might have noticed, so I don't really have a problem with telling people some of these things. But I also know that I have a certain platform and privilege, which means I can say those things, and that's not necessarily the case for other people. So it's making sure. I don't think it's a disagreement. Sometimes it's just about doing things differently.
Yeah, Stephen, what about you? As you say, how do you encourage divergence, circulation? Sorry.
I think it's about setting that sort of institutional and sector-wide tone. So we're really, really, really very good in the cultural sector, in the arts, culture and heritage sector, in celebrating success. And that's not criticism. I think we should do that. And I think that's fundamentally important in terms of keeping people's energy levels up and people's retention and commitment and all of these things. But again, when Morven's talking about fail space, we've got to be bolder about accepting, not necessarily always, it doesn't always have to be a spectacular failure, but we've got to set an institutional and a sector-wide tone that analyzes this stuff maturely. And it's like, and that the cultural institution or the cultural organization embraces reverse learning and recognizes when it's the junior partner. So not always being so convinced in the best possible way that you're going into a place or you're going into a location and you're going to do good there and you're only ever a force for good, but because that's the intention and that's what we're all passionate about. That's certainly how I go about my work. I would never go about my work thinking I'm intentionally going to go in and do something bad, but as we've all discussed, there can be consequences and repercussions, or there are groups and communities through no fault of their own that have been consistently overlooked and underserved. So in order for us to do better, we've got to recognize where those gaps are and move towards them. But like I said in my little presentation, what I tend to find, and again, this isn't a criticism because I do it and I know we all do it, I wouldn't want to write up a project and say, this failed, that was really bad, this community was alienated. We don't want to do it instinctively, we don't want to do it, but unless we start doing it, we've got no basis or ground to start doing that important work that we've all discussed, which is thinking about radically different ways of doing it. If it's not there, we can't move towards it. So it's setting the tone and saying, well, okay, we need to have more of a culture, which doesn't have to be always so celebratory. It can be, okay, there are major issues that need to be fixed here, and how do we do that, and how can we be more open about it?
Yeah, and I think there's an observation here from Jonathan. There's been a bit of a discussion going on in the chat here about failure, and actually I think Laura's point that you know, in a sense we have been pushed into a space into sort of alien experiences over the last couple of years, and this idea that failing fast, we as a society possibly we're more comfortable with failing fast, so that it feels like there could be a sea change moment in which these conversations are very timely, right? So the idea that you can, that if you're hampered by ideas of failure being, you know, if they bog you down, you can't, you're unable to learn from them. So the moving on quickly and ability to do that feels to do with all of those things, doesn't it? So I was very struck by what you were saying earlier on, Laura, about sort of, you evaluation only responds to systemic issues, but I suppose I'm that messianic about it, that I do wonder whether it's part of what helps us to address the systemic issues, because actually without that evidence of that the ability to speak about what's really going on, it's quite difficult for us to challenge those things. So I think that's an interesting question for all of us, whether this is the key to change. Now, I've been very greedy and I've been asking lots of questions. We've got some quite interesting practical suggestions coming out from everybody here. Has anybody got any particular questions for this group, or anything they would particularly like to raise before I move on to some of my other questions?
So, a very long, complex question.
They take some proper reading, I have to tell you. That's so. Lots of interest in the embedded model. I think lots of interest in the more of the critical friend, more of a clear, transparent role for the evaluator who's part of an iterative process of learning and design, which I think is really interesting. Let's have a look.
I think there's something as well.
Question from Jose.
Yeah,
Jose, go on?
How can you evaluate complex aspects in a cultural project as changes of perception, sense of belonging, or sense of purpose, especially when you work with communities? I don't know why I asked that question. That's been really complicated.
I was like, can you repeat it and stick it back in the chat again?
Yeah, I'll put it back in the chat.
I'm just looking for Jose's question. It's a really good one. So was that up high?
Under Emma's post about just after Morven finished speaking.
There was something though, I think, when Lara was speaking to Stephen earlier, like every time you guys speak, I'm like, yes, I want to talk about that. But there's something about the pandemic and how the pandemic has changed everything. And even though we're kind of back to normal in inverted commas, there is no normal, there is no going back to how it was before. And Stephen's point again about like this idea that funders are looking for predetermined outcomes, that is impossible. And actually the pandemic showed that, if you had to pivot to digital suddenly, that wasn't a predetermined outcome. No one could have predicted a pandemic and the effect that would have on the cultural sector. And on the way people did things there and then. So there's something I think about having that conversation with funders, and funders I think are open to potentially being more open to risk when it comes to kind of going, okay, well, this is kind of what we're looking for. But as I say, when we were talking about the community hubs, like enforcing that bums on seats approach is probably a mentality of an institution that comes from a mentality that they think they're getting from a funder, when actually funders are more open to different types of meaningful engagement when it comes to communities.
But yeah, that's my systemic issue, is that, and I don't even like the word communities. There's loads of words I don't like anymore because of how they're used, but that's about the sector, some organizations saying this is our cultural product and you will come and engage with us, and it's all about, it's not co-produced, it's kind of tokenistically, maybe they've had a consultation, a round table or something like that, but we're still expecting everyone to come in and engage. And actually the pandemic has disrupted that completely, because people find their own ways to culture. It all redefined what culture meant for them in a way that's, there's agency within different groups of people now that you didn't have before, or if it was there, it was very hidden. So I think that's going to be the game changer in how we look at evaluation as well. And I think Emily's point about sense of culture, about evaluation which strives for positivity. I really hate happy evaluations. They're just like, well, they're just because they gloss over it, Well, that's going to be the quote of the day now. Lara hates happy evaluation.
But I think, Stephen, you said something really interesting earlier on about that. Being honest and learning from every cycle of every experience we have, and adapting to better next time, or adapting to how we'd like it to be, doesn't mean to say you can't celebrate success. And I think we sort of see that in slightly a binary way, that actually we don't like Kepler culture, happy clappy style of it was all great, on the other, but actually, but you need a bit of those things as well, right? So I'm not sure that the two things can't coexist. So there's the things that you might say publicly, and then there are the things that you learn. And I do worry that we kind of that by arguing against one, you're sort of suggesting that you can only have do you know what I mean? I think that you can have your cake and eat it in some extent.
You can. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we need to put forward examples of good practice, and when cultural organisations and institutions and events do remarkably well and they do good things, but you've got to remember, just be very careful about the effect on that on staff, particularly in terms of them feeling self-conscious or overstretched or pressured about doing work that they don't believe to be particularly of that caliber. And then that can have knock-on effects as well, because they feel tired and frustrated and under-resourced, and they're perhaps not winning the same awards as their peer organizations or peer professionals. And then that internally, again, can be a bit of a setback when we're talking about doing this complicated work where you've got to embrace failure or embrace divergence, which for very good reasons can, in terms of your emotions, it can inflict trauma, not just on the community participants, but also the members of staff that are being asked to do that work. So we've just a balance. Yeah, absolutely right. And I wouldn't, I think the thing is about embracing complexity. I think that's what we're all talking about. I think reality and complexity, and there isn't a single outcome for every single person on a project. All the people involved in that, all the participants in that project, probably whether they express it or articulate it or not, have a different idea about what this project is, what it's capable of, and what they want to get at the end. Now, we need to have vast resources to be able to sort of entertain all of that, but we can get close to it. We can begin to sort of think, what is a more complex circular model, and how can we sort of prioritize the needs of the participants? How can we prioritize the needs of the participants and question some of those other metrics that Lara and Morven and you've raised, Dan, about bums on seats and spend in particular shops, which are very important as well. But I tend to find that the needs of the participants in the project don't necessarily get the same weight as the other things.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's some very interesting things emerging in the chat here again. So I'll have a quick look at it in a moment. But I think this is you said something earlier on about sort of setting a tone, didn't you? And I think there's one of the things that point raises is how much as if you're leading the evaluation or if you're facilitating it, how much there's, you know, the tone of kindness and you know, the possibility of everybody learning is so much an important sort of design aspect of it, because actually, you know, I think the desire to perhaps champion the voices that you think aren't being heard, you know, also creates some sort of, so there's something there about setting a tone sectorally, but also within the projects, isn't it, that I feels really, really important. And that in some, you know, I brought up in the first place the need, particularly for emotional intelligence around some of these issues. I've just been reading, I haven't finished it, but I've been reading Alan Lane's book about the club at the edge of town, you know, just talking about Slung Low's experiences and his own personal degree of self-awareness about his, you know, the views that he brought and how they were sort of challenged by being very up close to what people were saying to him. So this ability for ourselves, you know, as individuals first, and then as kind of communities. I want to come on, I'm very interested in this question of metrics. You've all been very rude about metric ways of understanding success. I want to challenge you on that, but I'm just checking here some interesting questions. Emma, you've been reading the chat. Is there any questions that you just bring in for us here at all?
Yeah, I mean, just one on Sophie, just which is related. I think Sophie Hope had the question, which I can read out unless Sophie wants to read it themselves.
Yeah, Sophie, I've just seen it. Yeah, Sophie, do you want to talk?
Where is it? About examples of convincing local authorities or cultural organizations or indeed funders of actually putting their money where their mouth is and investing in these embedded longer term, longitudinal, qualitative approaches to research and evaluation, because it tends to be way more expensive than
Yes, I mean, you did just mention that it takes an enormous amount of resource and so on. And I suppose that's what I was going on to say, Sophie, was to say that, you know, sometimes having the right spirit doesn't necessarily cost a lot, but actually the longevitous embedded approach perhaps is more, might be more resource intensive up front, but, you know, better value. So yeah, I think that's two questions, isn't it? One about how you manage to persuade people. I think there's also a question about asking people to change the brief when you start on something. Any tips or thoughts about, you know, kind of getting your commissioning partners on track?
Should I go? Or but yeah. Only because I don't know, it's been a really interesting, it's been a very interesting year and a half, and I've worked with Anne to declare an interest on a very big project. I think also I'm very uncomfortable about the word convince, because again, this kind of sets it up in opposition. I'm going to put a link in the chat. So I'm an associate of a consultancy called the Fifth Sector, and I think in the 18 months, I think we started working together January 2021. we're now working all over the country. So in a lockdown, I managed to work all over the country, which I find with a load of people that are not actually, I'm in Birmingham, who aren't in Birmingham. So my work is now predominantly outside of where I live, bearing in mind most of it was taking place when I was at a desk like this. And we have been, I'll put the link in, there's a piece I wrote about it, which is more about the consultancy, but actually it was the people that we worked with, which are local authorities, there were combined authorities, and or councils, and they're very much around place-based stuff, but they knew they'd done so much work around what was happening in their areas that they really understood, they understood what was going on in their city or in their town, particularly when we're talking about areas where there's some really big socioeconomic problems. And it was really thoughtful. So we didn't have to convince anyone. They might have thought of doing things a certain kind of way, but I would like to think that actually those partnerships were really collaborative. But again, when we were having conversations with one of the councils saying, we talk about young people, and then I knew somebody who works with young people in that city, so we did a round table with some of the people she worked with, and there was a whole issues about young people, but about and how they use that city and how they use the town centre, for example, because of perceived issues of safety. Now, that was only because we went and talked to some people that came out, and because nobody knew that. But if you walk around the town centre, you think, where have all the young people gone? Because there's nobody in after a certain kind of time. And so we brought that back and said, actually, we have to reframe how we're doing it. And that has been great. So I think it's important to try, and this is not going to happen with everyone, by the way, because people are people at the end of the day. But I would say that most of the work that I've done in the last 18 months that's been place-based, we have been really lucky to work with people where it's not been a convincing conversation. It's been a really, it's been actually that kind of very iterative, how did you frame it, Stephen? That was that kind of almost like
circular.
Yeah, the circular kind of loop kind of conversation.
Circulatory.
Yeah.
I love that.
That was more consultancy than evaluation, but actually the principle was exactly the same. So it's quite iterative in how we worked with them. So I'm not, I might have just looked out that's we got some really great clients to work with, but I think it's if you have to do it at the start again, it has to be at the start.
Yeah. So I think you'll see Jane Willis has just put a couple of things in, so saying, getting it right from the start and building the consensus from the start. You can't, that really feels like a it's a miss that and you're in trouble. I think there's an interesting question though about, so Emily, I don't know if this is slightly cynical a question, Emily, or it's from the heart, but do we have any experience of people being really honest in your evaluation about failure and then trying to get more funding from the same funder? I mean, I'm going to ask you about both of those things. We've also get this comment from Jane saying it is possible to make evaluation reciprocal, where everybody, participants of all kinds, learn, benefit, and grow and enjoy and create as part of it. So I think we've got these two things sitting next to each other. I mean, I suppose I always come back to this idea as sometimes being evaluated, sometimes being the evaluator, is that actually there are different stories you can tell with the same evaluation, isn't it? It feels to me that what's important is that, primarily the first responsibility is to yourselves and the learning that you may do, whoever yourselves may be. And actually, if you need to tell a story to people, then use the information you have to tell the best story that you can. I mean, there is a job to be done here, isn't it? But actually, it's as long as you don't convince yourself of the wrong things, it's how truthful can you afford to be? And I think this idea that we have a responsibility to those that we're on a journey with in evaluations in other terms, I think is very strong in what you've just been saying there. So any thoughts there? I think
I find it, Emily's question quite amusing, because I suppose I've been there too. I've been the recipient of arts funding, or been working on projects that have been recipients of arts funding, and then when it gets to the evaluation, because you want your final 10% or whatever, you just go, oh no, everything was fine, it was great, thank you. And there's also, I think, sometimes this fear that if you're honest and open about actually what went wrong, or actually what the funder could have done to support you better, that you might be seen as difficult or problematic and not get funded again. And I was working on a project a few years ago with a group of artists, and I and the lead artist were filling out the evaluation at the end. And I think it was like, okay, is there anything you would like to tell Creative Scotland? And I was like, oh, I normally just say no here. And she was like, what? She was like, I've got some feedback. I've got some stuff to talk about, not only the project, but their role in this. And interestingly, actually, the head of the department at Creative Scotland, once they received that evaluation, got back in touch with the artist and said, thank you so much. It's really refreshing to hear some honest feedback for us, and we'll be taking that forward. And I honestly think that if a funder is worth their salt, they will encourage critique and feedback and conversations about failure, and then maybe work with you to find out how that can be made better in the future. And it shouldn't be a reason to fear that you won't get funded again in the future.
Stephen, you're nodding violently there. What your thoughts? I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it? Given what else we've been saying, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with Morgan, and it's that point that Laura made before as well. I think we do become too comfortable in sort of excusing certain models and frameworks and engagement when we say, oh, the funder won't accept that, the funder is restricted us in that certain way. You've got to remember that the funders as well, they are open and honest about where their gaps are. So when you think about the National Lottery Heritage Fund, there's a reason why they want more LGBTQ plus led projects. LGBTQ plus led projects, so not just projects that institutions which are predominantly straight, and again, that's not a criticism, it's just an observation, running projects on behalf of LGBTQ plus communities, but certainly NLHF being very clear that they want more applicants from that community. And similarly, the reason why they have a mandatory outcome, you've got to fulfill the mandatory outcome, which is a wider range of people will engage with your particular heritage project. So they are shifting as well, and I think they are receptive to it. I know of professional instances when I was still working in museums when we went back to funders and said, the project has changed significantly and we need to reallocate spend to this. And one of the reallocations of that spend was actually paying community co-curators. So we needed to pay them. And that was a challenge at the beginning of the project, which hadn't been considered in nearly enough detail as it could. So I've experienced it when funders have actually shifted when the recipients come back. But also, they're open and honest about where their gaps are as well. And you could work with them on that.
I was going to say, and Nicola's just observed that Nicola Bell, who knows, has just observed that NHF are very receptive to those things. We've seen Paul Hamlyn Foundation putting very strong. Sophie just mentioned that, and Bernadette Lynch as well. But Paul Hamlyn Foundation putting a very, very strong emphasis on learning as a way of. So I think that's right. I think, and you were saying, Laurie, maybe we've just been really lucky, but I do think there is a sea change. I think there is much as. The cultural organizations and as evaluators, we're all kind of saying we've got to, we are interested in becoming more relevant organizations, and we have to do some deep learning to do that. So I think there is a, for all that you have to report to Treasury eventually in some way if you're a state funder, that actually there is quite a lot of understanding and a big interest, because there's a big interest in us behaving in many voiced ways in general. I think there is more of I think it's wrong to assume that there's not a kind of a nuanced understanding among funders, and we should have those conversations. We should certainly be part of having that conversation. Sorry, go on, Laura.
Well, just to add to what Stephen said, because the thing is, you can only evaluate what you can see. So if you were doing whatever you talk about, so for me, the gap in exactly what you just talked about, Stephen, and I would particularly talk about coming in a city from like Birmingham, which has a non-white majority, for example, but that's never reflected in commissioning, or if you look at the Commonwealth Games, things like that. Now, my thing about an evaluation, any of these kind of projects, is actually the failure isn't the failure of the evaluation. It's actually about the systemic issues that came about in the first place. So I was having a conversation with somebody the other day and said, but we can only evaluate X, Y, Z if and we're going to give away X amount of places to people from marginalized backgrounds. Well, nobody's come forward, or nobody's taken part, or audiences haven't come. Well, we need to really address the issue here. The big elephant in the room is actually, because you haven't done it properly, you don't have the engagement that you think you have. So actually what the evaluation should look at is in the gaps in and the mechanics of how you're doing that in the first place. And and I have a real issue about when we say, well, there aren't enough that you get straight-led organisations telling LGBTQI stories. We definitely have that around ethnic diversity, and actually that's, so we're not changing, the mechanics still exactly the same. And if the evaluation goes, but we've got, well, and I think what's going to happen post-pandemic or post-lockdown is actually that people are deciding with their feet. They're not going to come in because they can engage. They've engaged in lots of different ways in lockdown. So would you? I made a choice not to engage with anyone that didn't do particularly things that was civic minded, that was a funded organisation in Birmingham. If they didn't do things civically over lockdown, then I don't participate in their work anymore, because that's my choice to do that, because I work in a food bank and I do lots of other things, and I look at people that were on furlough, say, well, what did you do for your city? So I'm a winner killer. I'm choosing not to get, and I'm not the only person that makes those decisions. So I think there's an issue about how people are working, and that's what the evaluation does need to pick up. Actually, not that X amount of people didn't come to your project. What are the issues that are structurally in place that mean that X amount of people won't engage with your project? And maybe we can stop talking about engagement with or all of these sort of things. Yeah, or because it's a lot of things being done to people, isn't it?
Yeah,
and if you're not doing your engagement properly, so your evaluation properly, then how are you going to learn from your failures? Like, and how are we actually going to make the systemic changes that are required?
So. And that's the story you don't want to hear, because actually, and that's the bit I think somebody mentioned National Lottery Heritage Fund. I've had great, conversations with Arts Council. That's not necessarily been a problem. I think sometimes we assume a lot of things. I mean, I ran very big European programs, and which are a nightmare to evaluate. So we do commission, and I was audited on them constantly. Now, actually, what we were reporting on was metrics. What we actually evaluated was the stuff that we needed to know. Now, it wasn't that whoever was spending time with you wanted to know that or not, but actually there was a story that we needed. But it wasn't like when we commissioned evaluators, we captured both of those things.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a lot of sifting through a lot of data, which in the end may or may not help us. It's being able to pull out the plums that helps to do different jobs, isn't it? And I think the idea that our funders aren't also some of the voices, the different voices that we need to have similarly sensitive two-way dialogue with, I think is if you imagine funders are just another part of your stakeholder mix of different people bringing together different things. It's the same sort of skills, isn't it? There's some really interesting conversations going on about the My Cake report. Lots of advice to go and have a look at that from 2011. Sometimes the old ones are the best ones. I was really interested. I was sort of struck by how much that this conversation about not being too fixated about what the outcomes of your project are going to be. That's definitely part of Mark Robinson's advice, and I think it's everything I've ever heard about many-voiced evaluation is to be sort of open around outcomes. And again, that conversation about working with our funders to talk about potential outcomes, and that learning as an outcome might be a very important one, might be part of that job of, if not convincing, then going on a journey with people as well. I was going to say that I'm going to just give you notice, guys, that as we wrap up this conversation, I've asked all of our speakers to come up with one or two bits of very crunchy advice that they'd leave us with to go into the next part of our conversation. So just be prepared. I'm coming on to that moment now. I did want to just pick up on this issue of metrics. You've all been very down on metrics. I think metrics, personally, I strongly feel that metrics have their role to play, because I think you can have as many blind spots about metrics as you can about qualitative sorts of impacts. Is there a place for them? Stephen?
I live. By the way, I'm a massive numbers geek, and I love spreadsheets. And I can quote you.
I like both. I like both in their place, I think.
I could bore you, Stephen, about my European funded programs, and I know that I tripled the outputs, and I can tell you it was on jobs, created jobs. I could do all of that still, all these years later. So, no, of course I do, because again, actually, the numbers tell a story. I actually do think that data tells a story. I think it's what you're evaluating. So if you are looking at participation, for example, if that participation is not happening, you need to look at how you're doing it. But I think it's really important to look at data, for example, when you do look at Arts Council data in terms of MPOs and DYCP, for example. Now, when you look at how the data has changed in terms of diversity, about the number of freelancers and artists from different marginalised backgrounds applying for DYCP, you can literally see that year on year how that's improved, and how that has, and that in turn is now having an impact on the portfolio in terms of project grants. I am the sad person that reads those metrics and can tell and can read that story.
So, Stephen, what about you? Quality, quantity, both matter.
Well, absolutely. I mean, some of these projects are absolutely huge, and there are multi-million-pound capital projects that consume vast quantities of public money. So in terms of metrics and sort of quantitative, we need to know that when that capital project opens, or when Leeds 2023 opens, or the factory in Manchester opens, that given the size of investment that they've been given, that they're going to get the footfall that they predicted that they were going to get, because there has to be a sort of public accountability and return on that amount of investment. So if it's going into one large project and not being distributed across smaller projects, then we need to see that return. And of course, that can only be done in a way which captures that vast amount of data and quantity. Sorry. Oh, go on. Yeah.
No, go.
Yeah, but I mean, mine would always be sort of qualitative for the reasons that everybody's raised, like and spending sort of long periods of time getting yourself embedded and getting those narratives and building the trust, so people feel uninhibited in one sense, that they can share their exact thoughts and feelings and articulate them with you. But yeah, some of these projects are so big, and they're taking the investment is so vast that quantitatively we need to know what's going on there. So yeah.
I guess is there something about the quantification of the qualities that, you know, the quality experience we have as well. Morven, so just to round up, have you got a piece, what lasting piece of advice would you wrap up this session by giving us?
I was going to talk about metrics. I was also,
and then come into that.
I was also just going to say that, like, all like multiple stories can be like true. Like, so I mean, again, you were talking about the stories that you tell your funders, the story that you look at internally, and the metrics are all just the same variations of the fundamental project. In terms of a top tip, one of my basic things is just to always think about what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and why you're doing it. And there's a little caveat to that. Something I've been thinking of recently is just if you're best placed to be doing that work. I suppose Stephen was talking about that example of organisations running projects for minoritized communities, but not actually being led by them themselves. And, you know, as an addition to that, if you're maybe not best placed to be doing that work, consider potentially stepping aside or resourcing someone else who's already doing it, and investing in that.
I really like it. The fundamentals, what, why, who. Thank you. Stephen.
I would just always say, I mean, it's good to do peer-to-peer work, so museum to museum or theatre to theatre, but I have always found it massively beneficial to seek out other organisations that are not cultural organisations that have probably been doing this work for much longer than the cultural sector has been doing it. So when we talk about co-creation or co-commissioning, when we think about the NHS, or we think of smaller community interest companies that have been working with communities on the ground to deliver different services for nigh on 40, 50 years. So I would always do that. Yeah, seek out organisations, seek out like-minded individuals that perhaps are not in the same sector as you. And that's quite revelatory, because what you'll find is that something like co-creation or inclusive evaluation is probably happening in other sectors, in other organisations beyond your own. And you can develop really strong relationships and draw inspiration and collaboration from there.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so seek great practice from elsewhere. Seek a diversity of practice from beyond your doorstep. Yeah, great, brilliant. Thank you. Lara, last word.
I like having the last word. I think interrogate what you mean by your measure of success or indices, because I think it's multiple measures of success, and that gets you around that kind of binary conversation about metrics and/or. So it might be that there's a framework of success that we're looking at rather than a single output.
Yeah, I like it, and that takes us right back to how do we deal with the sort of success failure binary. Thank you. Sorted. Done. Right. In that case, I've also asked all of our speakers if they had any inspirational reading and other resources for us, and I'm going to ask them to drop that into the chat, because I see it is now 3:30, just on. So what I'm going to do is to say thank you so much, Lara, Morven, Stephen. You've been fantastic in giving us lots of food for thought. I think I'm right in saying that Lara and Stephen might hang around to be involved in the sort of second part with us, but Morven's got to dash. So I want to say really big thanks to all three of you, and thanks to everybody for also having a fantastically interesting conversation in the chat and being involved on multiple levels, which is pretty hard going. So let's have a quick break now. Morven, thank you. Farewell. See you soon.
There was one thing I was going to mention, is that I should also mention the Fail Space Conference, which is happening in Musselburgh, which is near Edinburgh, and Queen Margaret University on the 7th of December. So you are.
And is it live?
Yes, I'm not sure if there's a hybrid option, but I think Emma's going to pop something in the chat.
That is very exciting. So I've really loved having the conversation about Fail Space. I'm going to try and be there. Great stuff. Well, listen, thank you very much. Let's take now a 10-minute break. And when we come back, Emma will take us, well, we'll go through with us what we're going to do and how we're going to reflect on and share some of those thoughts. Please join us if you can. We forgive you and understand completely if you can't. Please, if you're going to leave us now as well, please do fill in that evaluation. If not, we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you so much. We noticed, because you can dart around and have a look at what everybody else is doing on the Miro board. And if you haven't done so, do encourage you to. But we noticed that group 4 were just getting to group 4 was a small group, so we imagine you were having an interesting conversation. We're just starting to take some notes down. But the good news is, everybody, that we're going to leave this board open for a while. How long is it open for? A few days, Emma?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can keep it open.
So if you suddenly have any thoughts, or you want to go and have a look at some of the other conversations, we'll leave it there for a few days. But anyway, thank you so much for taking part in that. I hope it was interesting and useful. Looks as though group 2 were flying from the start with lots and lots of interesting comments and exchange. But just to give ourselves a couple of minutes, would anyone like any observations or any takeaways that anyone would like to share with us? Anything that particularly struck you for that session that you would like to share with the rest of us? Meanwhile, have a little look. I see everyone's feeling really chatty.
I think actually we literally came back into the room when Kate Fraser was just I put it in the Kate actually about coming back to who is the evaluation for, because I think we did it actually ourselves as a group fall into the trap of talking about funders and people, but actually coming back to who is an evaluation for.
Yeah, and I mean, it's noticeable that I think that in Mark's, in that his House co-creating evaluation, his advice is the very first question you have to ask is, who is this for? And in doing so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Sort of fundamental, really, if we were sharing our thoughts with everybody. Anybody else? I hope you did get a chance to jot down any resources or stories that were really useful. As I say, we're very keen to pick up on those. Any really great examples of good practice, or indeed of things that you'd never do again, but you're happy to share with people. I think also really useful. Okay, well, pop a message in the chat, or please do just speak up if there's anything you would like to reflect. But with the last couple of minutes left, if not, I'm going to say do take a look around at those Miro boards. There is one more of these this current series of the evaluation principles in practice, and this one is looking, the next one, which is on the 1st of December, is looking specifically at how we bring creative methods into our work as cultural sector evaluators, or indeed as beneficiaries of cultural sector evaluation. I think speakers are still to be announced. I think that one is also sold out and there is a waiting list, but if you're really interested and you're not already signed up for that one, it might be worth joining the waiting list. I mentioned, I don't think I did mention before, that we are planning to we're working on a MOOC, a massive open online course, looking at some of these very practical issues that we've been talking about here, something coming out next year. So hopefully that's something that might be of interest. And indeed, if you have great stories to tell and would like to have any material included in that, we'd be really interested to know about it. So for these reasons, we are desperate to know what you think. Please do fill in that feedback form. I think that Andy's just dropped in or Robin's just dropped into the chat for us again. And I think there's very little else I should say, apart from sharing a little bit of Centre for Cultural Value news with you. The Collaborate Fund has just opened up for round 2 of the seed funding for innovative research, innovative evaluation ideas, by the way. I think it's up to a £20,000 grant. The expression of interest window is open until the 25th of November, so I do encourage you to go and have a look again on the Centre for Cultural Value website. Have a look for the Collaborate Fund to find out a bit more about that really exciting evaluation collaboration opportunity. I notice here as well that our latest vision paper has just come out around culture, health and well-being, and I think you can also find that on our website as well. Anyway, lots of things happening for the Centre for Cultural Value website. If you haven't joined the mailing list, do so now, and then you can find out about it hot off the press. It just remains for me, I think, to say thank you so much all for taking part. Thank you for sharing your ideas with each other and on the Miro board. Thank you to Laura, Morgan and Stephen, to Maria for captioning, to Robin, Adam, Robin, Andy, and particularly to Emma, who has done an awful lot of the work to make today happen. And mostly, as I say, thank you all very much to all of you for coming along. Please do join the Centre for Cultural Value mailing list if you'd like to know more about these things. You're not on it already. Brilliant. Thank you all for taking part today, and we'll see you soon.